We continue our series in John, A New Beginnings, and we turn to the next mini-series, which is the 7 Signs of John. And we are in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And in the 7 signs, John has this unique series of 7 signs. And a sign is not just a miracle. A sign is a miracle plus a message for John. And so I want you to think about the message not just to the people of Jesus' day, but also to us as well. And so I invite you to reflect on at least 4 things, which is what the sign says about Jesus, what the sign tells us about people of that day, and what the sign says to you and I, and then who might we share the blessing with, the good news with, that we have learned about the sign. And so the first sign is the sign at the wedding feast. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water so that they may be filled to the brim." Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water and had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you saved the best till now." What Jesus did here at Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. May the Lord bless his word to our hearts and minds this morning. Well, as I said, we are in the 7 signs of John, and this morning looking at the sign of the wedding feast. Well, heard this story that I love about this little boy who was out playing by the street one day, and this man came along, and he came up to this little boy and said, "Son, I'm lost. I'd like to know where the post office is. Can you help me?" And the little boy said, "Sure. Go down to the stop sign, turn left, and then go down. It's on to the corner." And then the man said, "Well, I want you to know that I'm the new pastor in town, and if you come to church this Sunday, I'll tell you how to get to heaven." Little boy said, "No thanks. You don't even know how to get to the post office." Well, haven't you needed some signs sometimes in your life? Maybe you've been lost out on a country road. You're just looking for a sign. And thank God for GPS. Sometimes my daughter and I have been sort of lost or taking a reroute on a vacation and kind of wondered where we're going. And sometimes we need signs. Other times we were in Chicago. This was a couple years ago before the pandemic. And it was a really cold Chicago day. I mean, below zero. I don't know what possessed us to go up there, but we just were in an adventurous mood. And so we're up on the Miracle Mile. And my phone, my Apple iPhone is going almost out of charge. And we needed to find some different things. And so we stopped somewhere and asked if there's a place that we could charge. And the lady at the Starbucks store, because we stopped for some hot chocolate, said, "Listen, there's a big Apple store just down Michigan Avenue here. It's on the left, and you can't miss it because there's a big Apple sign." And we thought to ourselves, well, that should be easy. So we're walking down Michigan Avenue, and I'm just blistering cold. It's just windy, and my hands are numb. We had to stop inside the door just to get a break. And so we kept looking for this Apple store and this Apple sign. Could not find it for anything. And so then finally we gave up, and we walked partway up Michigan Avenue, and then some said, "No, it's just down here before the river." And we were like, "Before the river? We just walked down to the river." So anyway, we're walking down there, and finally we walked right up to the edge of the river, and we looked over, and there's the Apple store. Now, no one told us that the store is glass, okay? And that the Apple insignia is only seen from the side. So we're looking right through the store, and the part where they serve people is below on the steps. I don't know if you've ever been up there, but it's like the store was invisible to us. All we needed was the Apple sign turned this way, move this way. Well, anyway, there's also signs that we need in our life, aren't there? I mean, you might be looking for a sign that's going to give you direction in a relationship, or a sign that's going to give you some direction of where you might work or where you might fulfill a career. And for a lot of us, we need a sign about some direction of where we need to go with our relationship with God. And so I think this story this morning is beautiful. All the stories, the 7 signs, are beautiful. But I think this is a special story, and I invite you to walk back in it and to discover the miracle, but more importantly, to discover the message for you. Now, Jesus is invited to a wedding in Cana, Galilee. This is before Jesus started his ministry, but he had had some disciples that just started to follow Jesus, and Jesus' mother was invited to this wedding as well. Well, in the middle of the reception and this big feast, they ran out of wine. Now, you know that it's a faux pas for us today to run out of food or run out of wine, whatever, at a wedding reception. But back in that culture, it was really important to have enough, and it cast a bad shadow, a little bit of bad luck, if you would, on the whole couple for the rest of their lives. And so Jesus' mother comes to Jesus and says they've run out of wine. And I want you to note what Jesus says. It seems kind of brusque, doesn't it? Jesus said, "Woman, what does that have to do with me?" It's like, whoa. But Mary had a little bit of chutzpah. That's what we say in the East Coast, or, if you're up in Chicago, and our Jewish friend said, she's got some chutzpah. She looks at Jesus, and then she looks at the servant next to him and says, "Do whatever he says." Do whatever he says. I love that. And Jesus tells these servants to take these stone water jars used for ceremonial washing that are 20 to 30 gallons apiece, tells them to fill them all the way up. And then once they've done that, tells them to take a cup of it, a glass of it, to the wine steward, the master of the ceremonies, and he takes it. He doesn't know where the wine has come from, but the servants do. He takes a glass, a sip of it, and he says, "Wow, this is the best wine." Most people use the best wine first, so later on, when people are a little tipsy, they don't notice the difference, then they bring out the older stuff, the cheap stuff. And so in that moment, the whole wedding is sort of saved, and it's a beautiful moment. But I think there's a lot more to that. And the first thing I think is that in that moment, when Mary looks at Jesus and asks him to get involved, Jesus had a choice, either to get involved or to not get involved in this wedding. I mean, this wasn't central to his ministry, right? And Jesus made the choice after his mother said something to get involved. And I think in our own lives, that's really important to recognize that Jesus wants to get involved in our lives if we invite Jesus into our lives. Jesus got involved. But here's the key. The key is what Mother Mary said. Do what Jesus says. Those 4 words. Do what Jesus says. It's great. She just said, do what Jesus says. And they did it. And amazing things happen. And I think when we do what Jesus says and invite Jesus into our life, then we're going to discover a number of things. And the first thing is we're going to discover abundance. All right? I think that's really important, because if you look at this wedding moment here for a second, the water is turned into wine. The people have a great time enjoying this feast, and the couple's life is blessed, and all their families are mingling together. They're blessed as well. And I think in our own lives, that's really important. But something else that's in that discovery of abundance is the ordinary is turned to the extraordinary. The water is turned into wine. The couple in the beginning of their life is blessed in an extraordinary way. And for all of us, I think there's times in our lives maybe where we run out. Our cup seems empty, doesn't it? Right? So, and I got one right here. Yes. Nothing in there. Don't worry. Have you had a moment where your cup seemed empty? Right? Whether it's in a relationship or your spiritual life seems dry. Wine, by the way, in this time, in many cultures, is a symbol of joy. So maybe it's just that you're out of joy in your life. Your cup is empty, and you don't know what direction to take. If you invite Jesus into your life, and if you do what Jesus says, you can discover abundance. Jesus can take the empty cup, fill it up. Jesus can take the water and turn it into wine. And so for you today, what area of your life feels empty that you need a little blessing from the Lord? Invite Jesus in. And do what Jesus said. And when you do, you will discover abundance you never believed before. There's a wonderful story that I love by Kierkegaard, as the Danish philosopher. He tells a story of this priest that was in a rural parish. And it was out in the country, didn't have a lot of funds, and the altar cloth on the altar was getting really old and tattered. And the priest could not find the funds among the deacons and what have you to replace the altar cloth. And so he went to a seamstress in the congregation and asked her if she might make an altar cloth for the altar. And even though she was a very talented seamstress, he said, well, Father, I could never do that. I mean, I am a good seamstress, but I could never make an altar cloth worthy of our church altar. Well, the father persuaded her finally to go ahead and try it. And so he waited a couple weeks and asked her how the altar cloth was coming. She said, well, Father, it's not ready. And so he said, okay. He said, let's give it another couple weeks. And so a couple weeks went by, and the priest went to her again after the service and said, well, how's that altar cloth coming? She said, Father, it's just not ready. It's not ready for the church altar. And another couple weeks went by, and the priest went to her again and said, now, how's that altar cloth coming? She says, it's just not ready. And so the priest said, I'll tell you what. Why don't I come by this week? And I'll come by, and you and I will bring your altar cloth to the church and place it on the altar, just the two of us together. And she said, okay. And so the priest went to her home, and there was the altar cloth all put together, sewed and woven. And they together, the two of them went to the church, and it was evening time. And so the church was a little dark, and her and the priest went up and laid the altar cloth carefully on the altar. And then the priest said, okay, let's step back and turn on the lights and look at it. And so they stepped back and turned on the lights, and the woman just took a deep breath, and she said, why, Father, it's more beautiful than I ever imagined. And the priest said, that's always the way it is when we give our best to the Lord and then place what we have on the altar. God makes it more beautiful than we could ever imagine. And I think in the story of this wedding feast, that really applies, because you and I many times feels like all we have is water, but if Jesus blesses it, Jesus can turn the water into wine. What do you have today that needs to be changed from the ordinary to the extraordinary, that needs God's blessing, where your cup needs to be refilled and overflowing, and where God's blessing can do amazing things? So when we do what Jesus said, we discover abundance. And then I think also that's here is that we need to learn to invite Jesus into our celebrations as well as our sorrows. You know, for a lot of us, sometimes we wait till a crisis to go to God. Sometimes we wait till a heartbreak to go to God. But in this moment, this young couple had the foresight at least to invite Jesus to their wedding, right? They didn't know all the things that were going to happen. And I think God would like to be invited into our celebrations as well as our sorrows. Now listen, Jesus is going to be there in your grief and in your heartbreak, in the downturns of life. But Jesus also wants to be invited into the celebrations of life. And when we do that, amazing things can happen. This couple invited Jesus into the beginning of their family life. And I think that blessed their whole relationship. Where do you need to invite Jesus into the celebrations? Into a wedding. And by the way, we always mention this passage in a wedding. And I think it's so important. And I don't know if you've seen the Cana cross, which I love, which is a cross with two wedding rings, and inviting God's blessing into a marriage and into a family. And so don't wait to be a grandfather. Don't wait even to be parents, but invite Jesus into your relationship as husband and wife, and as a family, as grandparents, and into the celebrations, not just the end of life, but the beginning of life as well. Where do you need to invite Jesus into the celebrations and not just the sorrows? And then finally, to share the blessing. Now, you notice they didn't keep the blessing to themselves, right? They shared it. When the water was turned to wine, they took it to the steward. The steward said, this is great wine. This is the best. What have you been holding back on us for? And then they served it to all their guests. And I think it is a metaphor in some sense that you and I need to share whatever blessings that God blesses our life with. And that's important. So how is God blessing you today? And if God blesses you in the area where you may have an empty cup now, how can you help those around you, in your family, in our church family, in the wider community, in the wider world? How can you bless others to be a testimony for what Jesus is doing? I want to end with one final note, which is this. Mary is only seen twice in the Gospel of John. The first time is in this moment right here, where Mary is the one who recognizes that the wine has run out and asks Jesus to do something. She asked Jesus to get involved. And Jesus did. Jesus got involved. The second time that we see Mary in John's gospel, you may know, is at the foot of the cross. When Jesus looks down at Mary and he looks down at John, who's writing this gospel, and looks at his mother, and maybe in some sense, Jesus looked at his mother and said, look, I got involved. I'm even taking death itself and somehow blessing it and making it new life. I'm taking death and making it the resurrection. I'm taking it death and making it amazing grace and love. And through that blessing, all the world, all of creation will be made new. So today, when your glass seems empty and all of life seems lost perhaps, or you're just weary from all the world and trying everything on your own, then do what Mary said. Do what Jesus says. And when you do that, you will discover abundance and you will experience blessing, not just in the sorrows of life, but in the celebrations of life. And I hope you will share that blessings with others. Will you join me in prayer? Lord, as we look at this sign that shows us not only a miracle, but also speaks to us in a message to our hearts that rings down through the ages. Help us to open our hearts and lives to you and ask you to bless our lives, that the water may be turned to wine, that the sorrow may be turned to joy, that we may invite you into all of our lives, that through your blessing we may be a blessing to others. In Christ's name, and all God's people said, amen.